It was a Tuesday night, almost a year to the day, and I was standing in an office that had my name on the door when the phone rang. Not the office, the whole floor, the whole building actually. I bought it 8 months earlier with money nobody thought I'd ever see. And on the screen was a number I had deleted but never forgot. A number I used to call when I was happy. A number that, the last time it called me, was calling to tell me the locks had been changed. My wife, my ex-wife, Rachel. I stood there and let it ring, once, twice. I watched her name light up the dark like it had any right to still be in my pocket. And I thought about the man who would have lunged for that phone a year ago. The man who got fired on a Monday and watched his marriage walk out the door before the same week was over. The man who sat on a bathroom floor at 3 in the morning and did the math on how little he was worth to anyone, including himself. That man would have answered on the first ring. He would have said her name like a question, like a prayer. But that man was gone. I had buried him myself, slowly, over 12 months, in a one-room apartment that smelled like instant coffee and other people's leftovers. So I let it ring. And here's the part I still can't fully explain, even now. As I stood there watching her call, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. I felt something colder than both. I felt nothing. And nothing, it turns out, is the most expensive thing you can ever buy back. You want to know how a man loses everything in 5 days and ends up owning the building a year later? How the people who let go of his hand came crawling back to find it full. Sit with me. I'll tell you all of it. From the Monday morning my boss couldn't even look at me. Because the story isn't about the money. It never was. Let me take you back to that Monday. I want you to understand something before I tell you how they let me go. I wasn't a man who took things for granted. I came from nothing. And I don't mean that the way people say it at dinner parties, all soft and humble. I mean we counted change for gas. I mean the good plates stayed in the cabinet my whole childhood because there was never an occasion good enough to risk breaking them. My mother raised me on a factory wage and a kind of silence I didn't understand until I was much older. She worked the floor at a packaging plant for 26 years. I can still close my eyes and smell it. That specific smell of the factory on her clothes when she came home. Machine oil and cardboard, and something sweet underneath it that I could never name. She'd hang her coat by the door, and that smell would fill the kitchen, and to me that was just what home smelled like. I didn't know yet that she carried things so I wouldn't have to. So when I got the job at Brennan Logistics, 11 years before that Monday, it meant something to me that I could never fully explain to the people I worked with. To them it was a job. To me it was proof. Proof that the kid who wore hand-me-down everything had finally clawed his way into a room with carpet and a coffee machine that worked. I gave them everything. 11 years. I missed birthdays. I answered emails from hospital waiting rooms. I drank that terrible hospital coffee at 3 in the morning, the night my mother had her first stroke, and I still logged in by 8 to cover a shipment because I was afraid that if I wasn't useful, I'd be forgotten. That's the thing nobody tells you about coming from nothing. You spend your whole life terrified that you'll go back to it. So you make yourself indispensable. You become the man who never says no. And then one Monday morning, you find out that indispensable was never a real thing. I knew something was wrong the second I walked in. It was too quiet. People I'd known for years suddenly found their screens very interesting. Nobody met my eyes. There's a particular kind of silence a building makes when everyone already knows something you don't. And I walked straight into the middle of it, carrying a coffee I'd bought for a day I thought I'd finish. My manager, Dale, was waiting by my desk with a woman from HR I'd never met. He couldn't look at me either. 11 years, and he stared at a spot just over my shoulder the whole time. He said the word restructuring. He said it like it was a weather event. Something that just happened, that nobody chose, that fell on me out of a clear sky. I remember asking, and I hate that I asked it. I remember saying, "Is it something I did?" And the HR woman gave me this practiced little smile and said it was nothing personal, a business decision. They'd already packed a box for me. That's the detail that still gets me. They had packed my things before I arrived. My photo of my mother, the little ceramic thing my niece made me, all of it, boxed up by a stranger's hands while I was still asleep in a bed I was about to lose too. Nothing personal, as if a man's whole life can be sorted into something other than personal. I carried that box out past all those familiar faces. Dale didn't walk me to the door. Nobody did. And as the elevator closed, I caught my own reflection in the metal, and for 1 second I saw my mother's face in mine. That same tired set of the jaw. That same look of someone who'd worked themselves to the bone for people who'd already decided they didn't matter. I sat in my car in that parking garage for almost an hour. I didn't cry. I just sat there holding the box on my lap like it was something alive. And I did the only thing I knew how to do when I was scared. I started planning how to fix it. I told myself I'd have a new job in 2 weeks. I'd tell Rachel tonight, calmly, like a man who had it handled. We'd tighten things up. We'd be fine. I actually believed that. I drove home rehearsing how I'd say it, choosing my words so she wouldn't worry, protecting her from the fear the way my mother had always protected me. I had no idea that the worst part of that week hadn't even started yet. I had no idea that the woman I was driving home to protect had already started packing a box of her own. I should tell you about Rachel. I met her 9 years before that Monday, and from the very beginning we came from 2 different worlds that had no business meeting. Her father owned 3 car dealerships. She grew up in a house where the good plates got used, where nobody flinched when the phone rang because a ringing phone was never a bill collector. She'd never once smelled a factory on a parent's coat. I used to think that difference was beautiful. I used to think it meant I'd made it. Look at me, the kid who counted change for gas, marrying into a family with a circular driveway. What I didn't understand, not for years, was that I'd never actually been let in. I'd been allowed to stand near the door. Her father shook my hand at the wedding and said, "Take care of her." And he said it in a way that meant he didn't believe I could. I smiled and said, "Yes, sir." I always said yes, sir. The boy who came from nothing learns early how to make himself agreeable to people who hold the things he wants. For 9 years I worked to close that gap. I wanted Rachel to never feel the lack I grew up with. I covered every bill the second it arrived. The bills on the kitchen table were my responsibility, my proof, my way of saying I belong here. I can hold this. I am not my origins. And she let me. That was the thing I'd circle back to 1,000 times later. She never once said, "Stop, you don't have to carry all of it." She just let me carry it, and I told myself that was love. So that Monday night, I came home with my box in the trunk and my speech rehearsed, ready to be calm, ready to protect her. She was at the kitchen table when I walked in, and there was already a stillness in the house that I recognized, because it was the same stillness as the office that morning, the silence of someone who already knows the thing you came to tell them. I started my speech. I got maybe 2 sentences in, restructuring. Nothing personal. I'll have something new in 2 weeks. And she didn't look surprised. She didn't reach for my hand. She looked at me the way you look at a problem you've already solved in your head. She said, "I think we both know this isn't working." For a second I thought she meant the job, the money. I actually said, "We'll be fine. I'll figure it out. I always figure it out." And she said, quietly, "I'm not talking about the job. I want to be honest with you, because there's no point telling this story if I dress it up." In that moment, I didn't feel heartbreak. Heartbreak came later, in waves, for months. In that moment, I felt something simpler and more humiliating. I felt caught. Like a man who'd been pretending to belong somewhere and had finally been found out. She'd been thinking about leaving for a long time, she told me. The job was just permission. The job was the thing that let her stop pretending too. And then she said the sentence that I carried around like a stone in my chest for the entire year that followed. She said, "I can't build the life I want on top of yours." On top of mine, like I was the foundation that had finally cracked. Like everything I'd carried, every bill, every yes sir, every late night, had just been the floor she was standing on while she looked for a better house. She was gone before the week was over. Not Friday. Thursday. She didn't even use the whole week I'd lost everything else in. Her father sent 2 men with a truck. I recognized one of them from the dealership. He wouldn't look at me either. That made 2 buildings full of people in 1 week who suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. I stood in the doorway and watched them carry out the good furniture, the furniture her family had bought, and I understood for the first time that almost nothing in that house had ever actually been mine. I'd paid for the life. She'd owned it. The last thing she said to me was at the door, with her coat already on. She said, "Don't make this ugly. Don't make this ugly," as if I were the one making anything, as if I had any moves left to make it all. And then the door closed, and the house went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. I sat down at that kitchen table, the one covered in bills that were now mine alone, in a house I could no longer afford, that I'd be out of within 60 days. And I'm not going to lie to you about what came next. Because the next 3 months are the part of this story I almost didn't survive. I lost the house in 2 months. There was no fighting it. No income, a mortgage built for 2 salaries, and a name on the deed that came from nothing and had no soft place to land. I moved into a one-room apartment on the wrong side of a town I'd spent my whole life trying to climb out of. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd run so far and so fast, and life had just walked me right back to where I started. Except this time I was 41 years old, and I'd had it all and lost it, which is somehow heavier than never having had it. The place smelled like instant coffee and whatever the last tenant had cooked into the walls. The radiator knocked all night. I slept on a mattress on the floor because the bed had been hers, technically, paid for by her father, carried out by his men. And I stopped answering my phone. Not that it rang much. That's the thing that surprised me most. When you're useful, the phone never stops. The second you're not, you find out exactly how many of those people were calling for you and how many were calling for what you could do for them. The answer, in my case, was almost none. The job search went the way those things go when you're desperate, and it shows. I sent out applications like a man throwing messages into the ocean. A few interviews. I'd sit across from someone 15 years younger than me, watching them read my 11 years at Brennan and do quiet math about why a man my age was suddenly available. I could see the question in their eyes. What's wrong with him? Nobody loyal gets let go. There must be something wrong with him. And the worst part is, I started to believe it too. That's what nobody tells you about hitting the bottom. It's not the money. The money is just numbers. It's what the bottom whispers to you when it's 3 in the morning and you're staring at a water stain on the ceiling. It tells you that maybe Rachel was right. Maybe you were the cracked foundation. Maybe Brennan was right. Maybe you were always replaceable. Maybe your whole life was a man pretending to be more than the kid who counted change for gas. And now the pretending was finally over and this room, this mattress, this is what you actually are. I want to be careful here, because I know somebody listening is in a room just like that one right now. There was a night, about 10 weeks in, that I came closer to giving up than I have ever told anyone. I won't lay it all out, because it doesn't need laying out, and because I don't want to hand it to anyone who's hurting. But I'll tell you, I sat on that bathroom floor for a long time. And the thing I kept thinking wasn't even dramatic. It was small. It was just, nobody would notice for a while. That's the thought. Not pain, just the quiet certainty that you've become so unnecessary that your absence wouldn't make a sound. What stopped me was the phone. It rang at 3 in the morning, and for one insane second my heart leapt because some broken part of me thought it might be Rachel. It wasn't. It was my mother. She couldn't sleep, she said. She didn't say why she'd called at 3 a.m. She just said she had a feeling. Mothers and their feelings. She talked to me about nothing. The weather. A neighbor's dog. And the whole time, her voice did that thing it always did. That careful steadiness. The sound of a woman holding something heavy and not letting you hear the strain. And right before she hung up, she said something she'd never said to me in my whole life. She said, "You don't have to be anything for me to love you. You never did." I sat there on that floor with the phone against my ear long after she'd gone. Because I didn't understand yet why those words cost her so much to say. I thought she was just being a mother. I didn't know that she was talking about herself, that she was telling me, in the only way she knew how, about a guilt she'd been carrying for 41 years. I didn't know yet that my mother had a secret, one that explained everything about the way I was raised, the silence, the locked drawer, the name she never said out loud. I was about to find out, and it would change how I understood every single day of my life up to that point. But first, that 3 a.m. phone call did something else. It made me angry. And anger, it turned out, was the first thing in 3 months that felt like being alive. Anger is a strange engine. People talk about it like it's only a poison, and maybe it is, but there's a version of it that's closer to a pulse coming back. For 3 months, I'd felt nothing but the slow gray weight of giving up. And then my mother said I love you for nothing, and instead of comfort, what rose up in me was this hot, clean fury. Not at her, never at her, at myself. At the 11 years I handed to people who packed my box before I arrived. At the 9 years I spent paying for a life so somebody could tell me she couldn't build hers on top of mine. I got up off that floor. That's it. That's the whole dramatic turning point. No music. I just got up, and I washed my face, and I looked at myself in that cracked bathroom mirror, and I made myself a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I said, out loud, I am done waiting to be chosen. I'd spent my entire life waiting for Brennan to make me a partner, waiting for Rachel's father to finally shake my hand like he meant it, waiting to be picked, to be let through the door I'd only ever been allowed to stand near. The boy who came from nothing learns to wait. He learns that good things come to those who are useful enough, agreeable enough, patient enough. And it's a lie. I'd given my whole life to a lie. So I stopped waiting. Here's the part that sounds like one of those stories, but I promise you it wasn't. There was no genius idea, no lightning bolt. What I had was 11 years of knowing exactly how logistics companies waste money, because I'd watched Brennan waste it every single day. I knew the gap. The small and unglamorous gap between the big firms who were too slow to care and the small businesses who couldn't afford them. I knew there was a business in that gap, because I'd spent a decade being the guy who quietly fixed it for free. I had $400 to my name. I bought a cheap laptop secondhand. I built a website myself over 3 nights, badly. And I started calling small warehouses and family distributors, the kind of places run by people who came from where I came from. I didn't sell them a pitch. I sold them the truth. I told them I knew exactly how the big guys were overcharging them, because I used to work for the big guys. The first month I made nothing. The second month I landed one client. One. A family-produced distributor run by a man named Sal, who reminded me so much of the people from my old neighborhood that I almost teared up in the meeting. He shook my hand, a real handshake, the kind I'd waited my whole life for men who never gave it. And he said, "You did your homework, kid." I was 41. He called me kid. And it was the best thing anybody had said to me in a year. That first invoice, I framed it. It was for $800, and it felt like $1 million, because for the first time in my life I'd built something with my own name on it, not Brennan's, not Rachel's father's, mine. Nobody co-signed for me. Nobody let me stand near the door. I built the door. I worked like a man possessed, because I had nothing else. I had no wife to come home to, no co-workers, no family nearby except my mother on the phone. So I poured all of it into the work. 16 hours a day, I learned everything. I made every mistake a person can make, and I made them fast and cheap because there was nobody to catch me. And slowly, one handshake at a time, it grew. But this isn't really a story about a company. I told you that at the start. The company is just the thing that was happening on the outside. Because around the same time the business found its feet, my mother called again, and this time her voice didn't have its careful steadiness. This time it shook. She said she needed to tell me something before it was too late. She said she'd been to the doctor. And she said there was something I deserved to know about where I came from. Something she should have told me 30 years ago, and the only reason she hadn't was that she was ashamed. My mother, the strongest person I'd ever known. Ashamed. I drove 4 hours that night to sit in her kitchen, the kitchen that still smelled faintly of that factory even though she'd retired years ago. And she reached into the drawer, the one that was always locked, the one I was never allowed to open as a child. And she put a single old photograph on the table in front of me. And nothing about my life ever looked the same again. The photograph was old. The corners were soft from being handled. It showed a young man, maybe 25, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, squinting into the sun. He was wearing a good suit. Not a factory man's clothes, a suit. And he had my face. Not similar. Mine. The same jaw. The same tired set to the eyes even when he was young. I'd spent my whole life thinking I looked like my mother. I'd seen her in my reflection in that elevator the day I got fired. But this was something else. This was looking at myself wearing a stranger's suit in a decade I was never alive for. I asked her who it was, even though some part of me already knew. She didn't say his name. She still couldn't, after all those years. She just said, "That's your father." And almost everything I ever told you about him was a lie. I'd grown up believing my father was a man who died young in an accident. A good man, a poor man, a factory man like her, taken too soon. That was the story. That was the shape of the hole I'd grown up around. The truth was something else entirely. My father hadn't died. Not back then. My father had come from money. Real money. His family owned property, businesses, the kind of life Rachel's family would have looked up to. And when my mother, a factory girl, the daughter of nobody, got pregnant with me, his family gave him a choice, us or them. The girl from the floor, or the name and the inheritance and the future they'd built for him. He chose them. He chose the name. He let his family pay my mother a sum of money to disappear, to never use his name, to never tell me whose son I was. A debt that was never hers to pay, paid in silence, for 41 years. That's why the drawer was locked. That's why there was a name she never said out loud. That's why she worked that factory floor for 26 years with her back breaking, raising me alone, when there was a family across town with a circular driveway and a fortune who knew I existed and chose, every single day, not to. I sat in that kitchen and I felt the whole architecture of my life rearrange itself. Because here's what broke me. It wasn't the money. It was that I finally understood my mother. Every careful thing she'd ever done, the way she protected me from worry, the way she carried everything so I wouldn't have to. The reason she'd said you don't have to be anything for me to love you. She wasn't just being a mother that night on the phone. She was trying to undo a wound she'd watched a family put in me before I was even born. The wound of being the spare, the one not chosen, the one paid to disappear. I'd spent my whole life feeling like I was standing near a door I'd never be let through. And now I knew why. I'd been born on the wrong side of one. By design. And the cruelest part, the part I'm still not sure I've forgiven, is that she carried the shame. Her. The one who stayed. The one who worked. The one who chose me when she could have taken the money and walked. She was the one who lived with a quiet guilt for 41 years, ashamed that she couldn't give me more, ashamed of where we came from, when the shame was never hers to hold. It belonged to the man in the good suit. It belonged to the family that wrote a check to erase a child. I asked her why she was telling me now. And she got very quiet. And she said the doctors had found something, that she didn't have the years she thought she had. And that she couldn't go without me knowing the truth, because she'd watched me my whole life try to earn my way into rooms, try to make myself indispensable, terrified of being left, and she finally understood that she'd given me that fear without meaning to. That a boy who doesn't know why his father left will spend his whole life trying not to be left again. She was right. God, she was right. About Brennan, about Rachel, about all of it. I'd married into a family that made me say yes, sir. I'd worked 11 years for people who packed my box. I'd been chasing the same approval my whole life, from the same kind of people who'd written the check, never once knowing that the original wound had a name and an address. And that's when she told me the last thing, the thing that turned this from a story about my past into a decision about my future. She said my father was still alive. And he had spent the last several years trying to find me, still alive. After 41 years of being a dead man in my own story, my father was out there breathing, in a hospital across the state, and he was the one who'd started looking. My mother told me he'd reached out to her 2 years earlier, a letter, then a phone call. His own life had come apart, the way these things do. His family's fortune had thinned across a generation of people who never had to work for it. His marriage was long over. He had other children, my half-siblings, people who shared my face, and had grown up inside the very inheritance I'd been paid to disappear from. And now, old and sick, he developed a sudden interest in the son he'd erased. I felt sick listening to it, because I recognized the timing. He didn't come looking when I was a boy who needed a father. He didn't come looking when my mother was breaking her back on a factory floor. He came looking when he was the one who needed something, when he was the one who was afraid of dying unnecessary and alone. The exact fear he'd planted in me, come back around to him at the end. There's a justice in that so sharp it almost felt cruel to notice. My mother didn't tell me what to do. That was the most her thing about the whole night. She just laid the truth on the table, the photograph, the locked drawer finally open, and she said, I've carried this alone long enough. What you do with it is yours. I drove the 4 hours home before dawn, and I want to tell you I spent that drive full of righteous clarity. I didn't. I spent it shaking. Because the man who'd ruined my mother's life, who'd written the check that defined mine, was the same man I'd spent my whole life secretly grieving. You can hate someone and still have spent 40 years missing the idea of them. Those two things live in the same chest. They don't cancel out. And here's where the story folds back on itself in a way I didn't see coming. Because in the months that followed, my business didn't just survive. It caught fire. That gap I'd built into, between the big slow firms and the small businesses nobody served, it turned out to be a much bigger gap than I'd known. The pandemic years had broken supply chains everywhere, and suddenly every small distributor in 3 states needed exactly what I'd been quietly building. Sal told another family business. They told 2 more. I hired my first employee, then my 5th, then my 20th. The first hire, I remember shaking her hand and thinking about Sal, about how a single real handshake had pulled me up off the floor, and I promised myself everyone who worked for me would get that, would never feel like the spare. Within a year, the company that started on a $400 laptop was being valued at a number with too many zeros for me to say out loud without feeling like I was lying. I'd done it. The thing I swore on that bathroom floor. I'd built the door instead of waiting at it. And I felt almost nothing. That's the part nobody warns you about. I'd spent a year imagining how it would feel to win, to have more money than Rachel's father, more than the family that erased me. I thought it would feel like vindication, like finally being let in. It felt like standing in a big empty office at night, holding a phone, realizing the people you wanted to prove it to were never worth proving it to. The money didn't heal the wound, it just gave me a bigger room to feel it in. And then, within the same few weeks, two things happened that forced my hand. Two phones, you could say. Two ghosts calling at once. The hospital called. My father had taken a turn. If I wanted to see him while he could still speak, it had to be soon. He'd asked for me by name. The name he'd paid to keep me from ever using. And my mother, my fierce, careful mother, who'd kept her own diagnosis quiet because she never wanted to be a burden, was getting weaker too. The two people who'd defined the absence and the presence in my whole life were both running out of time in the same season. I had a choice to make. About forgiveness. About what it's for and who it's really for. And I made it in a hospital hallway at 3 a.m. with a paper cup of that same terrible coffee in my hand, standing between two rooms. There's a particular loneliness to a hospital at 3 a.m. I knew it already. I'd lived it the night of my mother's first stroke, years before, logging into work by 8 because I was afraid of being forgotten. And now here I was again, in the same fluorescent hum, the same vending machine coffee, except this time I wasn't afraid of being forgotten anymore. I was afraid of something harder. I was afraid of who I'd be on the other side of the next few hours. My father was in a room on the 4th floor. I went up. I won't pretend I was at peace. My hands were shaking the whole way up in the elevator, and I caught my reflection in the metal again, the way I had the day I got fired, except this time the face looking back at me wasn't my mother's. It was his. I was walking into that room wearing the face of the man I was about to face. He was small in the bed. That's the thing about the people who loom over your whole life. When you finally see them, they're just a body breathing with effort, smaller than the hole they left. He knew me the second I walked in. Of course he did. He'd been looking at my face his whole life, in his other children, in the mirror. He started to cry before I'd said a word. And he said my name. The name my mother gave me, the one he'd paid to keep separate from his. I sat down. I didn't take his hand. Not yet. He talked for a long time. He told me his version. How young he'd been, how his family had threatened to leave him with nothing, how he'd convinced himself we were better off, how the money he sent was meant to help. I let him talk. I didn't argue, even when the excuses curled my stomach, because I understood something sitting there that I want you to understand too. He wasn't confessing for me. He was confessing for himself. The apology, after 41 years, wasn't a gift he was giving. It was a weight he was trying to set down before he died. He wanted me to take it from him, to say it's okay, so he could go easy. And that's the moment I understood the difference between the forgiveness that's impossible and the forgiveness that's necessary. I could not give him the first kind. I could not tell him it was okay, because it wasn't. He didn't just leave me. He let a woman I loved more than my own life carry his shame on a factory floor for 26 years. He let her hands shake and her back break. He let me grow up believing I was the kind of thing that gets left, and that belief had cost me a marriage and 11 years and very nearly my life on a bathroom floor. None of that was okay. It would never be okay. Some doors only open from the other side, and he'd locked that one himself, a long time ago. But I could give him the second kind, the kind that isn't about him at all. I took his hand, and I told him I forgave him. I forgave him not because he'd earned it. He hadn't. I forgave him because I finally understood that carrying it was costing me more than it was costing him. I'd been so afraid my whole life of being the spare, the one not chosen, that I'd let that fear run every decision I ever made. And the only way to stop being ruled by the man who left was to stop letting his choice be the most important thing about me. I forgave him for me, not for him. I sat with him until the sun came up. We didn't become father and son. It was too late for that. Too late to fix. Too soon, somehow, to feel nothing. We just existed in the same room for a few hours. Two men who shared a face, finally on the same side of the door. He died 9 days later. I went to the funeral. I met my half-siblings, who looked at me with a mix of curiosity and fear, because they knew. They knew there was money, and a will, and a name, and that I had a claim to all of it now. And I want to pause here, because if you've made it this far with me through all of it, the firing and the leaving and the bathroom floor and the locked drawer, then you already understand this story better than the people in that room did. So do me one small thing, subscribe and stay with me, because the last part is the part that changed me, and I'd want you here for it. Because at that funeral, a lawyer pulled me aside. And what he told me about my father's will was the last thing I expected. The lawyer was an older man with kind eyes and an uncomfortable job. He took me into a side room away from the half-siblings who were already watching me like I was a thief at their own father's funeral. He told me my father had changed his will 2 years earlier, right around the time he'd started looking for me, and he'd left me a share. A real one, equal to each of his other children. After 41 years of being erased, he'd put my name back into the document that decided who his family was. I think he meant it as the apology he couldn't make in person, a way of saying, on paper, in the only language his family ever respected, that I'd been his all along. And I understood, standing in that little room, that there was a version of me, the version from a year and a half earlier, who would have wept with gratitude, who would have finally felt chosen, who would have taken that inheritance and held it up like a trophy and said, "See, I belonged. I was let in. The door opened after all." But that man was gone too. I'd buried him on a bathroom floor and built someone new out of $400 and a second-hand laptop. So I asked the lawyer one question. I asked if my half-siblings needed the money. He hesitated, and then, because he was an honest man, he told me the truth. The family fortune was mostly gone. Bad investments. A generation that spent without earning. My father's house was mortgaged. His other children, the ones who'd grown up inside the inheritance I'd been paid to leave, were not the wealthy heirs they appeared to be at the funeral. They were people about to lose everything, holding on to a name that no longer came with money attached. The spare, it turned out, was the only one who'd had to learn how to build something, and in learning it, I'd become the only one in that family who didn't need a cent of what was left. There's a justice in that too sharp to even feel like winning. I signed my share over to them, all of it, the other children of the man who left me. I didn't do it because I'm a saint, and I want to be clear about that, because the coach version of this story would tell you I rose above it and forgave with an open heart. I didn't. I did it because I finally didn't need it. Taking that money would have meant it still had power over me. It would have meant the inheritance I was denied still defined me, and I was done being defined by what that family chose to give or withhold. I built it with my name, not his. I didn't get even. I got free. The lawyer looked at me like I'd lost my mind. The half-siblings never even thanked me. They didn't know. I asked him not to tell them where it came from. Let them think it was the estate. Let them keep the one thing I'd never had, which was the comfort of not knowing they'd been left behind. I drove home that night lighter than I'd been in my entire life. Not because I'd done something noble. Because I'd finally set down a weight I'd been carrying since before I was born. And then I drove straight to my mother. She was weaker by then, smaller in her chair, the way my father had been smaller in his bed, the way everyone who looms over your life eventually becomes just a person, tired and human and running out of time. But her eyes were sharp as ever. I told her everything, the will, the share, what I'd done with it, and I watched her face as she understood that her son had been handed the inheritance that was stolen from him, the proof, the vindication, the open door, and had given it away without a second thought. She started to cry, and these weren't the careful, contained tears of the woman who'd protected me my whole life. These were something that had been locked in a drawer for 41 years finally coming loose. She took my face in her shaking hands. And she said the thing that, of everything in this entire story, is the only thing I'd carry into a fire to save. She said, "I spent your whole life ashamed I couldn't give you more, and you just became more than all of them." That was the inheritance. Right there, her hands on my face. Not the will. Not the company. Not the building with my name on it. That. And it was in the weeks right after that, with my mother's words still ringing in me, settled and free, and finally whole, that my phone lit up in the dark one Tuesday night. An unknown number turning into a name I deleted but never forgot. Rachel. So now you know everything that man knew, standing in that office, watching her name light up the dark. You know why he didn't lunge for the phone. You know why the anger was gone, and the sadness was gone, and what was left was that cold, expensive nothing. I let it go to voicemail. And then, because I'm human, because no amount of building yourself back makes you a stone, I listened to it. Her voice was different, smaller, the certainty I'd heard at that kitchen table, the woman who knew she couldn't build her life on top of mine, that woman was gone too. People change. The year hadn't only happened to me. She said she'd heard. Of course she'd heard. The town we both came from isn't big, and a man who builds a company worth millions becomes a story people tell. Her father's dealerships were struggling, she mentioned, almost in passing, and I understood the shape of the call before she ever got to the point. I'd understood it the second I saw her name, the favorite and the spare. The one who got the house and the one who got the bills. She'd married the foundation and left when it cracked, and now she'd heard the foundation had become a tower, and she didn't know who else to call. She said she missed me. She said she'd made a mistake. She said maybe we'd both grown, and maybe we could just talk. And here's the truth I want to leave you with, because it's the only thing this whole year actually taught me. A year earlier, that voicemail would have been everything. I'd have called back before it finished playing. I'd have forgiven her in a heartbeat, not for me, but for the chance to feel chosen, to feel let back in through the door. I'd have rebuilt my whole life on top of hers, and called it love, and never noticed I was doing the exact thing my mother begged me to stop doing. Trying to earn my way into rooms. Trying not to be left. But I'd already learned what it costs to forgive someone. I'd learned it in a hospital room, holding the hand of the man who left me, understanding that some forgiveness is for you, and some is just letting someone set their weight down on you. And Rachel didn't want forgiveness. She wanted the foundation back. I didn't call her back. Not out of revenge. I want to be honest, there was no triumph in it, no speech, no moment where I told her off and felt the satisfaction land. I just looked at her name, and I felt the way you feel about a house you used to live in. A flicker of something. And then nothing. I deleted the voicemail, and I put the phone in my pocket, and I went back to work. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this, through all of it, then I think you already understand why. And before I tell you the last piece, do me that small kindness, subscribe, and stay. Because there are more stories like this one, and I'd want you here for them. My mother passed 4 months later, quietly, in her sleep, with me in the chair beside her bed. The factory smell was long gone from her clothes by then, but I swear I caught it one last time the night she went, machine oil and cardboard, and that sweet thing underneath I could never name. The smell of home. The smell of a woman who carried everything so I wouldn't have to. I keep that old photograph in my desk now, the young man in the good suit, my father. I don't keep it out of love, and I don't keep it out of hate. I keep it because it reminds me of the truth I learned too late, and just in time, both at once. We came from nothing, and the people who came from everything spent it, lost it, left each other, called each other when they were desperate, and ended up with nothing too. The house and the bills, in the end, weigh the same. It's just that some of us learned how to carry the weight, and some of us only learned how to hand it to someone else. I built something with my name on it. Not his, not theirs, mine. The kid who counted change for gas built the door he was never let through, and then he learned the thing that actually matters, which is that once you build your own door, you stop needing anyone to open theirs. I'm okay now. Not healed, exactly. You don't heal from a thing like this. You just get bigger than it. And sometimes, late at night, when the office is empty and the city is lit up below me, I think about that man on the bathroom floor a lifetime ago, the one who thought nobody would notice if he disappeared. I wish I could call him. I wish I could tell him to hold on, that the phone is going to ring at 3 in the morning, and it's going to be his mother, and she's going to be the first voice in a long line of voices that brings him back to life. So let me ask you something, because I read every comment, and I want to know. If it were you, standing in that office, watching the name of the person who left you at your lowest light up the screen a year later, would you have answered?